From WFIU in Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Kate Young, and this is Earth Eats.
When the phorids arrive, the ants release a pheromone that tells their nest mates, all the other ants that are in the vicinity, their sisters that are in the vicinity, tells them, careful, the phorids are here, you better go back to your nest or get paralyzed.
This week on the show, we get to nerd out on insects with Ivette Perfecto, who studies biodiversity and agroecology. She's got some wild stories to tell about bugs on coffee plants and the importance of understanding the delicate balance between species. Stay with us. Thanks for listening to Earth Eats. I'm Kate Young. My guest today is Ivette Perfecto. She's the Bunyan Bryant Collegiate Professor of Environmental Justice at the School for Environment and Sustainability at University of Michigan, where she leads the Perfecto Lab, focused on biodiversity and agroecology.
My lab is an agroecology lab. And what we do in my lab, me and my students, is we conduct research primarily in agroecology. And in particular, we're interested in understanding the ecology of agricultural systems so that we can manipulate them and enhance them for higher sustainability, resilience, productivity as well. And most of the work that is done in my lab is related to insects in particular. And so we're interested in biodiversity of insects and arthropods in general and their role in the agroecosystem.
If it's been a while since you were in a science classroom, here's a little refresher. Arthropod refers to any member of the phylum or group Arthropoda, which is the largest group in the animal kingdom. It includes lobsters, crabs, spiders, mites, insects, centipedes, and millipedes. More than 80% of all known species of animals falls into the arthropod category, and you'll find them in every habitat on Earth.
So insects can be detrimental as well as beneficial. We're more interested in the beneficial insects and their role as biological control or natural control agents in agricultural systems. The idea being that if you can maintain a high diversity of natural enemies, predators, parasitoids, and things that eat other insects, that you can then reduce or eliminate, hopefully eliminate altogether the use of pesticides.
So for our listeners who aren't familiar with the term, could you say a little bit about what agroecology is?
Agroecology has been defined as a science, as a practice, and a movement, all three. As a science, agroecology is basically what we do in my lab, is essentially using ecological principles to understand better agroecosystems. And so we apply ecological theory, ecological principles to the management of agricultural systems. And as a practice is simply using practices that enhance the sustainability of the system. Agroecology as a practice relies a lot in biodiversity. And so biodiversity is a key component of agroecological practices. And it essentially involves practices that probably most people are familiar with when they think about organic agriculture. So eliminating pesticides and using biological control, using bioinsecticides, not chemical insecticides, organic fertilizers, protecting the soil, protecting the water, reducing the use of water, recycling materials, etc., etc. And also all these practices that we normally associate with organic agriculture, but it's not just that. It's not just the elimination of pesticides or the substitution of pesticide with biological agents, but it's also the use of the biodiversity, it's the diversification. And finally, as a movement, agroecology, this component is very important because it highlights the socio-political aspects of agroecology. So, and this is one big difference between agroecology and organic agriculture. When you talk about organic agriculture, you're mainly talking about these practices, nothing to do with the socio-political aspects. But in agroecology, those socio-political aspects are essential to what agroecology is. And essentially, it incorporates issues of justice for the countryside, for the people that produce the food, and for the consumers as well. And so these interactions, reciprocal interactions between people and the environment are very important for the agroecology movement.
So it's justice for the people who are working in that food system, but also the surrounding communities.
Exactly. And one of the things that is really important in agroecology is the strengthening of the local food system. So it's not just about producing food, but it's about how food connects all of us and the strengthening of that food system that includes people that work in the field, farmers and farm workers, people that consume, people that distribute the food, etc. No, it includes all the stakeholders, all the people that are involved in the food system. And the idea is to produce a food system that is a fair system and that it doesn't contaminate the environment, and that is a sustainable system for the future, for future generations as well.
Right. Well, that really is a stark difference between just an organic farm, which could be using certain, sustainable methods for growing food, but maybe is growing food that is being shipped elsewhere that the people that live near it can't afford it, or, it's not really strengthening the local food system.
Exactly. Yeah, I have visited organic farms in California. Everybody that has gone to the Central Valley of California have probably passed by organic farms that are hundreds of hectares of a monoculture. And that would not be agroecological. No, having so many hectares in just a monoculture goes against the principles, the ecological principles involved in agroecology. And also, you can still have organic farms that have fairly unfair labor practices, and again, that goes against the principles of agroecology.
You talked about how your lab does focus on insects, and I was wondering if you could share an example of how your insect research is applied to these biodiverse agroecological systems. And I, in particular, would love to hear the story about the ants.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I love ants. Ants are fascinating organisms. So one of our research projects that has been going on actually now for many, many years is in Mexico, in the highlands, in Chiapas, Mexico, in the coffee growing region of Chiapas, which is the southern state of Mexico, the southernmost state of Mexico. And in that region, we have been working in agroforestry systems of coffee, where coffee is produced under shade. And there's a particular ant that we have been studying for a long time, and this is called the Azteca ant. Azteca is the genus of the ant. It's called Azteca sericiasur, but we just call it Azteca for short. The Azteca ant is a really effective predator against the coffee berry borer, which is one of the main pests in coffee, and other pests of coffee. And this ant is arboreal. That means that it nests on the trees. So it forms nests in cavities that are on the shade trees of this agroforestry system, the coffee agroforestry system. And sometimes it forms like a nest that is similar in appearance to a wasp nest. It constructs a carton nest. When the colony gets really big, it constructs a carton nest. But anyway, this Azteca ant is a very effective predator, as I mentioned before. But when the farmers look at this ant, they don't like it. First of all, it is very aggressive. It doesn't sting, but it bites the farmers. So when they have to manage or prune the trees, they crawl all over them and bite them, and they don't like that. But also they can see that this ant has a mutualistic relationship with a scale insect that is a pest of coffee as well, the green coffee scale. So when I say a mutualistic relationship, I mean that they benefit each other. So the ant tends the scales, like people are probably familiar in the gardens with the aphids, no? Ants tending aphids. And the same thing happened with this ant. They tend these scales, and in exchange for protecting the scale against the natural enemies, the scale release a sugary solution called honeydew. And the ants use that as the main source of energy for the ant. So the ant acquire this honeydew, and in exchange, they protect the scale insects from their natural enemies. So the farmers see this and they say, well, a friend of my enemy is also my enemy. So I want to get rid of this ant. But what happens is that the main natural enemy of this scale insect is a coccinellid beetle, like a ladybird beetle, like you find in your gardens as well. And this ladybird beetle is harassed by the ants. So when the ladybird beetle approach the area where the scale insects are, they get harassed by the ants. They get scared away by the ants and sometimes even killed by the ants. And so, you may think that, well, these ants are not really good because they are scaring away the main natural enemy of the scale insects, which are a pest of coffee. But when what we discover is that the beetle, the actual, the coccinellid beetle has a larval stage. And the larval stage of the beetle has these waxy filaments all over its body and is protected against the predation, the aggressiveness of the ants. So the larvae can be in these plants that are filled with ants, and the ants can't do anything about them. And so here you have, these ladybird beetles larvae that are hanging out in this area, and they are eating some of the scale insects. But the problem is that the ants harass the adult beetles. And so we started questioning, okay, what's going on here? You have this larvae that is eating the scale insects. The ants cannot prey on them, because they have all these waxy filaments that protect them against the ants. But the adults are harassed by the ants. And so how is it possible that the adults are able to oviposit on these plants, and the larvae get to these plants if the ants are harassing the adult beetles? And so we discover that the beetles actually hide their eggs under the scales. They hide their eggs under the scales, and they also look for other places to hide their eggs. So that's an answer to one of our questions. How are these eggs able to survive in these plants that are completely, filled with ants? And the ants are very aggressive, and they like the eggs, and they will they will bring the eggs back to their nest. So that was an answer to one of the questions. But then we thought, how are these beetles able to oviposit, take their time to find the scales, oviposit under the scale, if the ants are there and the ants are attacking the adult beetles? So that's when we discover that actually there is a parasitoid fly that attacked the ants. This is a phorid fly. This is a common parasitoid of Hymenopterans, which is the group of insects that ants belong to. And these phorid fly parasitoids, when they attack the ants get paralyzed because the parasitoids need the movement of the ants to be able to oviposit on the ants and attack them. And so when the phorids arrive to the plants, the ants get paralyzed, completely paralyzed, or they hide or go away. So you have this period of time when the forests arrive where the ants are completely paralyzed and their activity is reduced to a great extent. And that provides a window of opportunity to the beetles to actually go to the plant and hide their oviposit and hide their eggs under the scales. And so, this is incredible, because what you have here is, an insect that is basically using this opportunity that is provided by the parasitoid that is attacking the ants. But more incredible was what we discovered later on, is that essentially the beetle adult, the female beetle that needs to go to that plant to oviposit, actually can sense the pheromones of the ants when the forests arrive. Because when the forests arrive, the ants release a pheromone that tell their nestmates, all the other ants that are in the vicinity, their sisters that are in the vicinity, tells them, careful, the forests are here, you better go back to your nest or get paralyzed, no? And so the activity of the ants go way, way, way down, and the beetle can sense essentially that signal that the ants are giving to their nestmates, and use that as a signal to come. This is a safe time when you can come into the plant and the ants are not going to harass you or kill you. So we have done, experiments with olfactometers, which is this little device where you put these different odors and pheromones and look at the behavior of the beetle, etc., etc. And we have demonstrated that essentially the female beetles are able to detect the alarm pheromone that the ants release when the forests arrive. It's a particular pheromone that is released when the forests arrive, because we tested this with the regular alarm pheromone, and they don't react to the regular alarm pheromone. No, they get attracted to the specific pheromone that the ants release when the forests arrive. So essentially, they have been able to kind of decipher the conversation among the ants, the communication between the ants, and they eavesdrop, no? In the conversation of the ants, and use that as an opportunity whenever they feel, okay, the forests arrive, the ants are going to go down, and it's our opportunity to get there and oviposit.
Wow. So you're saying that it's not just a general alarm signal that the ants might give off. It is specific to this species that's about,
yes,
hey, we're about to get paralyzed. Either get paralyzed or go back into the the nest. And it's also interesting to hear that they have that system so that it's not just that every single ant is getting attacked. It's that the ants are retreating, and the ones that don't retreat are paralyzed. So that allows that window.
Yes, they get catatonic, they just stop moving, because the forage fly needs the movement to be able to attack the ants. And it's a very specific pheromone that they release to give that signal, because the other alarm pheromones, what cause is just general activity of and aggressivity of the ants. When they release an alarm pheromone, basically that's a general pheromone that makes them be more aggressive, more active, etc. It gives a very different reaction to the ants than this alarm pheromone that is, that they release when the forests arrive.
Also, this story involves 4 different insect species.
Yes.
That, to me, is also just incredible, all around this coffee plant and the tree that's shading the coffee.
Yes. And the incredible thing is that coffee is not a native plant to the Americas, no? Coffee was introduced to the Americas maybe 200 years ago. And so this whole system, which is a very complex system and very, very fine-tuned, no? with the beetle, female beetle responding to this particular pheromone that the ants release when the phorids arrive. This system must have evolved there, in the Americas. All these species are native of the Americas. The ant is native, the beetle is native, the phorid flies are native. The scale insect is pantropic, so it occurred all throughout the tropics. And so my hypothesis is that this system had evolved in the natural system, but once coffee was introduced, then, it basically moves into this coffee system.
Okay, so Ivette Perfecto tells this story beautifully, but it's a lot to take in one listen, especially without any visuals. So let me summarize again, just to make sure you understand the fantastic complexity of this system. Coffee berry borers are a pest that destroys coffee beans. Azteca ants attack and control these borers, so they're good for coffee plants. However, they also tend or farm green coffee scale insects, which are not good for the coffee plants. The ants protect the scale, and the scale release a sugary liquid that the ants consume for energy. Along comes the ladybird beetle, who, in its larval stage, eats the scale, so that's good for the coffee plant. The ants defend the scale by harassing and attacking the adult ladybird beetles, but the ants cannot attack them in their larval stage because they're covered in a waxy filament that the ants get tangled up in, so they avoid the larva. The ants would take the ladybird beetle eggs if they could find them, but the ladybird beetle hides them underneath the scale insects, which are largely stationary. But how do the ladybird beetles manage to lay the eggs when the ants will attack the adult ladybird beetles if they come close to the coffee plants? Well, the beetles wait for a pheromonal signal from the ants. The pheromonal signal is released when a parasitoid called a phorid fly is approaching. The ants will go hide in the nest, or they'll stop moving when the phorid fly approaches to avoid detection. This is the perfect window for the ladybird beetle to lay their eggs underneath the scale insect. Incredible, right? I said it was 4 insects, but let's count again. 1, the coffee berry borer. 2, the Azteca ant. 3, the green coffee scale insect. 4, the ladybird beetle. And 5, the phorid fly. That's 5. And all told, I think there might be a total of 8 insects involved in this system. This is just what she had time to tell us about here. It's time to take a quick break. And when we return, Ivette Perfecto, professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability at University of Michigan, will talk about how this research helps coffee farmers with pest control. Stay with us. Kate Young here. This is Earth Eats, and we're back with Ivette Perfecto with the School for Environment and Sustainability at University of Michigan. Hopefully, between Yvette's description and my quick summary, this complex relationship between interdependent insects is clear. The research is interesting in and of itself, but this knowledge has real-world applications for coffee farmers. Here's Ivette Perfecto.
As I mentioned before, the farmers don't like the ant, because they think that the ant is helping the scale insect, and also the ants are biting them. But the issue is that when the ants are there with the larvae of the coccinellid beetle, because they are scaring away all the natural enemies of the scale insect, which they're protecting the scale insect, they also scare away the parasitoids of the beetle larvae. So they're inadvertently, they are also protecting the larvae of the coccinellid beetle. And it turns out that when you sample this insect throughout the farm, you can hardly find any larvae of coccinellid beetles outside the clusters where the ants are located, because they are constantly parasitized by this. There are a number of, like 5 different parasitoids. These are parasitic wasps that attack the beetle larvae. And so that means that the beetle cannot reproduce outside of these clusters of ants. So what initially seemed to be a problem for the farmer, where the ants are tending the scale insect, turned out to be actually the main refuge for the reproduction of the main natural enemy of the scale insects. If they eliminate the ants, they are basically eliminating these clusters where the beetle is reproducing and is protected from the natural enemies. And so this essentially will eliminate the main control of the scale insects and might generate an outbreak of this scale insect.
So are they seeing in the coffee fields that the areas where the ants are nesting near those trees, that's where there may be a little bit of a concentration of scale because the ants are tending them, but that's also the place where this beetle is reproducing.
Exactly.
And that beetle is controlling the scale throughout the coffee field. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So basically what we're telling the farmers is that they need to tolerate a few scale insects in these clusters where the ants are in order to maintain the main biological control agent of the scale insect in the entire farm. And I should mention that we have follow-up. We have a very large plot where we have quantified how many trees have nests of this ant, et cetera, et cetera. And it's about maybe 5% of the trees in this shaded coffee farm have this ant. So, basically you have a very small areas when you consider the entire coffee growing region, very small areas where the scale insects might be at higher densities. The scale insects are in the coffee bushes that are surrounding, basically just like 2 or 3 coffee bushes that are surrounding the tree where the ant is nesting. And so out of thousands and thousands and thousands of coffee plants, you have a few plants located right next to where the nest of the ants are that have high densities of the scale insects. But other than that, you have also the maintenance of the main natural enemy that control the scales overall the entire coffee farm.
I imagine that it can be difficult to communicate this kind of information to farmers or to share the complexity of the understanding that you're gaining through this research. Like, how do you work with the farmers to get them to understand the complexity of this system that you're observing and documenting?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because when we started uncovering, this whole network of interactions, complex interactions, we asked the same question, how can we communicate this to the farmers? Some farmers actually have a really great intuition about things in nature, especially small-scale farmers that are there every day and are observing. But some of these interactions are really hard to observe or impossible really to observe, because they are very indirect interactions. And sometimes even the phorid fly is really, really tiny, and it's very difficult to see. And so you need to know what to look for in order to see it. So some farmers are very keen to these, complex interactions and all that, but others are, it's more difficult for them to understand all these complex interactions. So what we decided to do, initially we were just giving presentations and just, presenting this network of interactions, presenting pictures of the organisms and what happens, etc., explaining. And that's fine, but, you hear it and you understand it and you say, oh, that's interesting, but then time passes and then you forget about it, or you cannot explain it to somebody else. And so we decided to develop a game And this is like a board game. Well, not like a board game. It is a board game that's called Azteca chess. And it basically includes all these organisms. It includes the ant, the scale insects, the beetle, larvae, and adult, and the forage fly. And essentially, it's play between two players. One player plays the ants and the parasitoids of the beetle. The other player plays the beetle and both the larvae and the adult. And essentially, the strategy is if you are the beetle, you win the game if you're able to eat all the scale insects that are on the board before you get killed. So if you're able to eat all the scale insects, you win. If you are playing the ant, then basically you win the game when you get rid of all the beetles in the game, in the board. And so, it doesn't portray the whole biological control that I talked about before, but it does give the farmers a really good idea of what these interactions are and all the complexities of the interactions, because they have to pay attention. If they're the ant, they have to pay attention to where the forage fly is located. If it's near them, they have to move. If you're playing the beetle, you have to pay attention to the parasitoids of the beetle larvae, and you have to pay attention to where the scale insects are located and where the ants are, so that you go away from the ants if you're the adult, but close to the ants if you're the larvae. And so anyway, it basically at the beginning is a little bit difficult for the farmers. Well, for anyone, I play it with my students as well. And at the beginning, it seemed very complicated. But once you play it one time, you start getting a good idea of what the strategies are and all that. And eventually, you really get into the rules of the game and the strategies and things like that.
And the roles of each insect, like you begin to understand
Exactly.
those at an intimate level.
Yeah, and we actually have done evaluations of how this impact the farmer's ability to retain the information. And so we have done some evaluations, and basically we have given presentations to the farmers about the system, and we have had farmers play the game and compare, what happens in both cases. And those that play the game are able to retain and understand really more deeply these interactions than the ones that just receive a presentation, like a PowerPoint presentation with the pictures and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me that they would retain the knowledge because they're engaged in play, they're in conversation, they're with each other, and they're trying to think like an ant or think like the parasitic wasp. And so it really,
Yes. And we have done Azteca chess tournaments with coffee farmers in Mexico. And the farmers really get into it. And initially we have them play both so that they can get a better understanding of what are the strategies, whether you are the beetle or you're the ant or the parasitoid. So they get a better understanding when they play both roles. But eventually they start developing strategies of winning the game. And so we have these tournaments where they play each other, and they keep eliminating each other, and at the end you end up with just two people that have won all the games and have become experts in Azteca chess.
That's awesome. I mean, it actually does sound like a fun game. I've played other games like that where you have a role and these are the outlines of what your character, your player can do. So yeah, I could see it being a pretty fun game.
It is fun. I play it every year with my students in my class. And they have a lot of fun. They always said it's one of their favorite activities.
I'm speaking with Ivette Perfecto about her research on insect interactions in shade-grown coffee operations and how she communicates what she's learned with the coffee farmers. It's time for another short break, and then we'll learn more about her background, what brought her to this work, and her fears and hopes for the future of agriculture. Stay with us. Thanks for listening to Earth Eats. I'm Kate Young, and my guest today is Ivette Perfecto, professor at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. She leads the Perfecto Lab, studying sustainable agriculture practices, agroecology in particular, and she has a focus on insects, studying their interactions and interdependencies in a search for pest management methods that are integrated with the complex systems of the natural world. I wanted to hear about her background and what brought her to this kind of work.
I am from Puerto Rico originally, and Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. And during the period of time when I was growing up in Puerto Rico, there was a shift in the economy from a mostly agricultural economy to an industrial economy. There was a push out of the countryside, basically disincentivizing agriculture in favor of people working in industry. And because of the increase in industry and this all sorts of different kinds of industries, but in particular pharmaceutical companies and petrochemical companies as well, they were contaminating a lot. So contamination in Puerto Rico increased dramatically. And so when I went to college to study biology, I got interested in environmental studies. Basically, I studied biology, but I got interested in the environmental impacts of these industries in Puerto Rico. And especially also the contamination of the oceans and the sea. Because a lot of these contaminants ended up in the rivers and then eventually in the ocean. And I was fascinated by the marine life. I wanted to study marine biology initially. I was highly influenced by the programs of Jacques Cousteau in the television and living in a Caribbean island, I was fascinated by the sea and sea life. And I was going to study marine biology, but then I also wanted to go out of Puerto Rico to experience something different and have new experiences. So I decided to study in the United States. And I applied to several universities. And the one that actually gave me a little bit of funding and all that was the University of Michigan. Now, of course, the University of Michigan, being located in Michigan, has no sea. It has a lot of lakes, the Great Lakes.
So she started studying limnology, the study of inland waters, such as lakes and rivers.
But at the time, there was a group in Michigan, at the University of Michigan, called Science for the People. I was also very political. I wanted my science to be relevant, and to be able to do something good for the people with the science. And this group called Science for the People piqued my interest, and I started working with them. But in particular, there was a subgroup of Science for the People who were basically, they were mainly ecologists that were developing their ecological studies in agricultural systems to basically understand better the ecology of agricultural systems and develop more sustainable agricultural systems. This is at a time where the word agroecology, basically didn't exist. Nobody was talking that much about organic agriculture or anything like that. So this was pretty radical at the time. And this particular group of people were doing studies on intercropping, diversification of the agricultural system. So let's plant more than one crop together, and let's study the ecology of this system in terms of pest control, what happens to the soils, etc., etc.
The group, led by John Vandermeer, was conducting their studies at the Mathai Botanical Gardens at the University of Michigan.
The way that they were conducting the studies was more like a collective. So it was a collective of graduate students that were working together, helping each other. And then after they did their work during, their maintenance of the plots, collecting the data and all that, I volunteered to work with them during the summer. I didn't have any research experience at the time. I basically didn't know much ecology at the time, but I learned a lot with, basically being out in the field with them. And then after we did all the work, we went out, had beer, and, continued talking about the research and the politics and this and that. And that, for me, was fascinating.
This experience really opened her mind to how science can be used to benefit people.
And also, how much fun it is, to be outside and sharing your ideas with other people and all that. And so that hooked me up. And basically, I decided right there to continue for a PhD in something, along those lines, which eventually I recognized that it was agroecology. But that was my initial, into this area of agroecology.
That is a great story. When you look at the loss of biodiversity, I wonder if it hits you particularly hard because of your intimate understanding of the complexity of the interactions of even just the few species that you've studied, but just that you get that, like, oh, if this is happening here, it's happening in all these other places. And, many of us who don't do this kind of research, we might not really care about, say, a parasitic wasp. But because of your understanding of the role that these species play in an ecosystem, do you feel like it? I don't know.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it really breaks my heart when I see the reports that have been coming out now for almost a decade of the reduction in insect biomass and insect diversity throughout the world. And the main culprit of that is the industrial agricultural system. For example, there's a study that came out a few years ago from Germany where they have been sampling insect for 30 years. And they have discovered essentially that insect biomass have dropped by 75%. 75%. And the sampling takes place in the forest reserves, not even in the agricultural areas, in the forest reserves that are surrounded by agricultural areas, by intensive agriculture. And this is only one of many studies that are coming out, basically demonstrating that agriculture is reducing significantly insect biomass and insect diversity. And so when you see these reports, it really makes you cry, because all that is being lost when you're losing 75% of the biomass of insects. It's just incredible. And if we don't do something, we might lose essential components of agricultural systems. One of them being the pollinators, A lot of our crops are pollinated by bees and other insects. And if we lose those pollinators, it's going to affect agricultural production in a very significant way. So I think that people have to be aware of the role of insects, the beneficial role of insects. Many insects are also decomposers. They play critical roles in the composition. So for nutrient cycling, they're essential. For pollination, they're essential. For biological control, they're essential. All these are important functions in agricultural systems, and we're losing them.
What concerns you most right now about our global industrial food system?
Oh, there's so many concerns related to the industrial food system. One of the main ones, of course, is climate change. People don't recognize that the food system, the industrial food system, not just agriculture, the production of food, but the entire food system, basically contributes about a third of the greenhouse gases. And so fixing agriculture can contribute significantly to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So that I think is really a crisis that is not something that's coming up, it's something that is upon us right now at this very moment. I think it really is one of the existential crises of our time, and we need to do something right away. And it's really frustrating because you don't see any action, you don't see any action from the politicians and the people that have the power to do something. But you see a lot of initiatives, certainly at the grassroots level, which is what gives me hope. Another thing that I think is really a crisis in the food system is the injustices of this food system. It's just affecting so many people. It's causing a lot of health issues, especially among people of color, among poor people that suffer the consequences. And so, just the pure injustices of a food system that generates so much wealth for so few people.
Do you see small-scale farming and agroecology as one of the solutions to some of the problems in our food system, our global food system?
Yes, definitely. I think is probably the main solution. Not the only one, but the way I see it is the main solution. Large-scale industrial agriculture is failing us in so many ways. It's not even producing the food, because the food that is being produced in these industrial systems, if you look at it globally, very few of that is being used to feed people. A lot of it is to feed animals, and then few people eat those animals. And some of it is for industrial purposes, like, soybean plantations and oil palm plantations that are taking up millions of hectares of land throughout the world. They're not being used to feed people. Who is feeding people are small-scale farmers, primarily, throughout the world. And so these farmers are more and more embracing agroecological systems because it makes sense for them. I mean, it's not necessarily that it's more profitable, but agroecological systems basically are systems that will provide the farmers with a stronger resource base. So they're building their soils, they're building biodiversity, they're building their biological control agents, etc., and they're making them less dependent on external inputs and on these corporations that are basically reaping all the benefits in the agricultural systems. So agroecology is being embraced by millions of farmers throughout the world. Maybe they don't call it agroecology. It goes by many different names in different places. But essentially, these systems that are based on biodiversity and ecological principles and recycling and conservation of soil and water, etc., these systems are being embraced by millions of farmers throughout the world. And they are the ones that are producing the food that is feeding most people in the world.
You're in Puerto Rico right now, and you're doing field research?
Yes. I'm working with ants here as well.
You are? Is it in coffee or some other crop?
We have a project in coffee here, but here we work with ants, but also with vertebrate predators. And here, the main vertebrate predators are lizards and coqui frogs. I don't know if you know of the coqui frogs, but these are really teeny tiny frogs that are very abundant. They are endemic to Puerto Rico, and they're very abundant throughout the island or the archipelago, no? And they are insectivores. And the lizards are also extremely abundant throughout the Caribbean, and they're also insectivores. So we're looking at the role that they're playing in controlling some of the pests of coffee, but also how they're interacting with each other. And sometimes they actually have negative effects on each other. For example, the ants that are very effective predators of certain pests in coffee can also scare away the lizards or bite them, and the lizards don't like to hang out in plants that have lots of ants. And so, there is this kind of negative interaction between some of the predators. So we're looking at those dynamics of interactions among the different natural enemies. And what is the net outcome of that? Is it positive or is it negative? And what can we do then to try to enhance the more positive effects and reduce the negative effects?
Wow, that's interesting. Do you like being out there doing that kind of observation?
Oh, yeah. I love being out in the field all the time.
I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to me and share this information. It's so fascinating, and I love hearing about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
That was Ivette Perfecto, professor at the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability, where she leads the Perfecto Lab, focused on biodiversity and agroecology. You can find links to her work on our website, eartheats.org. That's it for the show this week. Thanks, as always, for listening, and we'll see you next time. The Earth Eats team includes Eabon Binder, Alexis Carvajal, Alex Chambers, Toby Foster, Daniela Richardson, Samantha Schemenauer, Peyton Whaley, and Harvest Public Media. Special thanks this week to Ivette Perfecto, and to James Farmer and Julia DeBrucker-Valiant for connecting us. Earth Eats is produced and edited by me, Kate Young. Our theme music is composed by Aaron Toby and performed by Aaron and Matt Toby. Additional music on the show comes to us from Universal Production Music. Our executive producer is Eric Bolstridge.